right, so what we are going to add today, the second example that we did on that right-hand side where it ended up being a decimal, we're going to kind of add those. So there's two things that we are just going to add to kind of watch out for today. So we're just going to add these over on the right-hand side of your notebook as extra examples. So we'll do probably 3 that we're going to add into your notes. Same idea, but like I said, just a couple things to watch out for. So number 3, let's say we have negative 3x squared minus 20 equals negative 17x. Okay, so this is still the quadratic formula, which hasn't changed since yesterday. It still says x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, one of the things that's going to be a little different today is that the first thing we did after copying down the quadratic formula yesterday is we said, okay, here's what a is, here's what b is, here's what c is. But I mentioned yesterday that you can only do that when it's equal to 0. When everything is on the same side of the equation, which it's not. Okay? This is not equal to 0. So the first thing I need to do is I need to set this equal to 0. So probably the easiest thing to do here would be to add that 17x, which means I need to add it to the other side as well. Now, when you're moving things from one side to the other, okay, very important, and we talked about this a little bit with factoring, you need to make sure your terms are in order, which means your x squared, that negative 3x squared, has to come first. And after the x squared needs to be the x term. It has to be that plus 17x. Then you're going to put your constant, which is that minus 20. Now it equals 0. That's going to be one of the things that's going to be a little different today, is we're not always going to be set equal to 0. Now that it's set equal to 0, I can say, okay, well, a, that's my number in front of my x squared, so a is negative 3. B is the number in front of my x term, which is going to be 17. And then c is going to be that constant, which is going to be negative 20. And just like yesterday, we are going to very carefully plug those numbers into our formula. So in the formula, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the opposite of b. So the opposite of a positive 17 is going to be a negative 17, plus or minus the square root. And then underneath the radical, we are going to take b squared. So 17 squared minus 4. A is negative 3. C is negative 20. All over 2 times a, which is negative 3. So plugging everything in correctly. Now, this is the most important step in simplifying. We're going to do negative 17 plus or minus. I can't do anything with that. It stays the same. But underneath my radical, I can take 17 squared. 17 times 17 is 289. Now remember, the sign that comes after is so important because you are multiplying. Negative 4, it's always going to be a negative 4 because it's minus 4ac. You're multiplying negative 4 times a negative 3 times another negative 20. If you multiply 3 negatives together, what kind of answer do you get? You get a negative. Yeah, you get a negative. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 20 is going to be 240. All over 2 times negative 3 gives me negative 6. If you can get past this step, usually we start to see the light at the end of the tunnel a little bit. Because now I say, okay, well, I can subtract those. It'd be negative 17 plus or minus the square root. When I subtract these, 289 minus 240, that gives me 49 over negative 6, not changing anything else, just that subtraction. Well, now I I can take the square root of 49, so we get negative 17 plus or minus. This square root of 49 gives me 7, and it is still over negative 6. Now, once you get to this step, this is where you break it apart into your two answers. We have negative 17 plus 7 over negative 6, and we have negative 17 minus 7 over negative 6. Negative 17 plus 7 is negative 10. When you do negative 10 over a negative 6, a negative over a negative is a positive. And then this is where it would be better, instead of turning it to a decimal, because this would be a repeating decimal, it would be better to just reduce this as a fraction. So if you divide each of these by 2, you would get 5 over 3 for one of your answers. And for the other answer, negative 17 minus 7 is negative 24. Negative 24 over negative 6 gives me a positive 4. So similar to the ones yesterday, except we had to do a little bit of rearranging. Okay, let's try another one. So this would be number 4. Okay, number 4 says x squared minus 2x minus 2 equals 0. All right, so we are still doing the quadratic formula, so it would still be a really, really good idea to go ahead and copy that down. So x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Trying to get that memorized as best you can. Then we want to go back and identify our A, B, and C. Remember, you can only identify A, B, and C if it's equal to 0, which this one is. This one's already set equal to 0. So, A is the number in front of your x squared. What's my A? 1. My B would be what? Negative 2. And my C? Also negative 2. Now, very carefully, we're going to plug these numbers in. So we're going to do x equals, first I need to take the opposite of b, so we're going to flip that to a positive 2, plus or minus the square root. Now remember here, underneath the radical, we're taking b squared. And remember what I told you guys yesterday, that it does not matter if b is positive or negative. When you square it, it is going to be positive. But to be extra careful, we are going to make sure we put that negative 2 in parentheses to show that we're squaring the whole thing. We're not just squaring the 2, we're squaring the negative 2. Minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 2, all over 2a, which is 1. Okay, our first step in simplifying, we're going to do 2 plus or minus the square root. Remember, when I do negative 2 squared, that is negative 2 times a negative 2, which gives me a positive 4. When I figure out the next sign, this time I have a negative 4, a positive 1, and a negative 2. A negative, a positive, and another negative. What's going to happen there? It's going to be a positive because those two negatives are going to come together to create a positive. 4 times 1 is 4, times 2 is 8, all over 2 times 1 is 2. Okay, well, now I could add these together, so 2 plus or minus the square root. 4 plus 8 is 12 over 2. Now, this is where you're going to see a difference today, because yesterday, all of our square roots were the square root of 36, or the square root of 49, or the square root of 64. They were perfect squares. But just like with completing the square, it doesn't have to be a perfect square. When you take the square root of 12, you get a decimal. So we're just going to estimate, and we are going to round. So we're going to do 2 plus or minus. When you take the square root of 12, you get about 3.5 over 2. And just like with completing the square, nothing else changes other than the fact you're working with a decimal. To get our two answers, we are still going to do 2 plus 3.5 over 2. And we are going to do 2 minus 3.5 over 2. 2 plus 3.5 is 5.5. 5.5 over 2 gives me 2.75. 2 minus 3.5 gives me negative 1.5. When I divide that by 2, I get negative 0.75. Same idea as yesterday, but you're not going to always have perfect squares. Okay, let's do one more. All right, number 5. 3n squared plus 10n equals 5. All right, first thing, our new best friend, that quadratic formula. Let's copy that down. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, before I can identify A, B, and C here, what's the first thing I would need to do? Yeah, I need to set it equal to 0, so I need to subtract that 5 from both sides. And you want to make sure you put it in order. So that 3n squared is going to go first, then the 10n, then the minus 5 equals 0. So if I identify A, it would be 3, B would be 10, C would be negative 5. Now, if you want to get really technical here, the quadratic formula says x equals the opposite of b, yada, yada, yada. But for this one, I'm not really solving for x, am I? I'm solving for n. Guess what? The quadratic formula still works if it's not an x. I guess if you want to be really technical, we could say n equals instead of x equals. It's still going to tell me what x is. And we're going to take the opposite of b, which is negative 10, plus or minus the square root. B squared would be 10 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 3, times c, which is negative 5, all over 2a, which is 3. Okay, we're going to go through our simplifying, so it's going to say negative 10 plus or minus the square root. 10 squared is 100. The sign after the 100, it's going to be a negative 4. It's always a negative 4. A negative 4, a positive 3, and a negative 5. A negative, a positive, and a negative would be what kind of answer? A positive. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 5 is 60. All over 2 times 3 is 6. So we get negative 10 plus or minus. When I add those together, I get 160 over 6. Once again, if you try to take the square root of 160, it's not going to come out evenly. It's going to give you a decimal. So we'll just go ahead and keep it as a decimal. So when you take the square root of 160, you should get about 12.6. Everything else is going to stay the same. It's still a negative 10, and it's still over 6. And now you're ready to break it apart into those two answers. So we would take negative 10 plus 12.6 over 6. And negative 10 minus 12.6 over 6. Negative 10 plus 12.6 is 2.6. And then still divide that by 6. You get about 0.43. Negative 10 minus 12.6 is negative 22.6. Divide that by 6, you get negative 3.77.